Alright, I gotta be honest, a lot of times slow motion footage looks like complete garbage. But in today's video, I've got my top 5 tips to hopefully make your footage look a little more comparable to 4K. Let's do it. What's happening, everybody? Cody Blue here, and welcome back to the channel. Now in today's video, we're talking about slow motion footage. A lot of you guys have asked me, how does my slow-mo footage look so clean and so clear and almost as good as 4K footage? And while it'll never be as good as the 4K we're used to getting out of our cameras, today I have 5 tips for you guys to hopefully make your footage look a tiny bit better. Tip number 1, and this is probably the most obvious tip. You guys are gonna be like, why are you even telling me this? But the most important thing you can do to get quality footage, especially in slow motion, is to nail your focus. You have to get good focus. A lot of times I'll see shots in different people's videos that are just slightly out of focus, and that's enough to ruin the quality of your footage. Now, when we're talking about slow motion footage, it's already incredibly soft, and we need to do everything we can to make it look good. We need to, caress it, because that slow motion footage, it's tender. You can't really play with it too much. So it needs to be perfect, and your focus needs to be perfect. So nailing our focus is the most important thing when it comes to getting high quality, sharp footage. Now that's probably a no duh thing for you guys, but I'm sure a lot of you out there, especially those of you who shoot in manual focus, are using focus peaking to dial your focus. And while it does work, that's probably not the best method to do it, especially when we're shooting at lower apertures like f1.8 or f2.8. Now personally, I shoot 99.9999, pretty much 100% of my footage I'm shooting in autofocus. Whether I'm on the gimbal or whether I'm handheld, autofocus all the time, and I trust autofocus to get the shots that I need. Some of you guys may prefer manual focus, and that's totally fine, but when you're shooting manual focus, I would recommend using that focus magnification to make sure you're getting real tack sharp focus. A lot of you probably use focus peaking, and while that's fine for 4K because it gets you close, for 1080p, we really want to be using that magnification to make sure our focus is completely dialed. So that's my first tip, and probably the most important tip is get that focus dialed. So make sure you tune it in and make sure everything looks good and sharp before you start shooting. Tip number 2. So my second tip, I'm probably gonna get a lot of flack for this one, but this only goes for 1080p slow motion footage. So hear me out before you grab the pitchforks, okay? Now, for your 1080p 120 frames per second footage, whether you're on a Canon or a Sony, but especially if you're on a Sony because that's what I shoot with, use a little bit of in-camera sharpness. I'm not saying to bump your sharpness all the way to 1000. Obviously that's gonna look terrible, and that's not the look we're going for. But for me, I set my detail to 0 in my camera so that I'm shooting and I'm getting a little bit of sharpness in my slow motion footage. Now in 4K, sure, dial that sharpness down because the 4K quality is great. But in 1080p, I bump my detail to 0, and it seems to work perfect for me. It gives me that little tiny bit of an edge that I need to get my footage look a little bit sharper. So try it out, experiment. I know a lot of people will say that in-camera sharpness is the devil when it comes to filmmaking, but from my experience, putting your detail to 0 works perfect, and if you guys like the way my videos look, it's gonna help you like the way that your videos look too. So tip number 2 is add a little bit of detail in camera. On a Sony camera, bump your detail to 0. Now it's time for tip number 3. Tip number 3 is upload your footage in 2.7K or higher if you're uploading on YouTube. If you check YouTube's website, it'll tell you the different bit rates they allow for higher quality footage, but uploading in a higher quality is gonna give you a higher bit rate, which means a higher quality upload on YouTube. Now this might seem counterintuitive if you're taking your 1080p footage and upscaling it to 2.7K or 4K. However, the footage is actually going to look better on YouTube if you scale it and upload in 2.7K or 4K versus if you just upload it in 1080p, because 1080p, there's a lot more compression involved. So most recently, I've been uploading all my videos in 2.7K. I used to do 4K, but I kind of feel like 4K might be a little bit of an overkill stretching 1080p all the way up to 4K, but 2.7K seems to be a good medium, so I can bring my 4K shots down to 2.7K and my 1080p shots up to 2.7K, and then I get good quality footage both in 4K and in 1080p. So if you're not uploading in 2.7K or higher, give it a try and see if your footage looks a little bit better. Tip number 4. Tip number 4 is use an ND filter. Now I use a variable ND filter so that I can adjust my exposure on the fly. All I have to do is turn the front element of my lens and I can adjust my exposure. Now the reason we want to use an ND filter is because 1, it allows us to shoot at slower shutter speeds. The shutter speed rule says that our shutter speed should be twice our frame rate. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, it needs to be 48. If we're shooting at 120 frames per second, it should be 240, or on most cameras 250. So 250 is what I shoot when I'm shooting slow motion, and I always shoot with an ND filter. By using slower shutter speeds, we get a more cinematic look to our videos, and we get that motion blur that you're used to seeing on Hollywood movies and things like that. If we shoot at a higher shutter speed, you'll notice your footage can be a little bit choppy and almost too sharp. So it seems a little counterintuitive that we want our footage to be blurrier to look better, but using an ND filter gets our footage to look a little more cinematic, and it's gonna help us with our exposure as well. And that's kind of a second tip here to tip 4, is make sure your exposure is dialed. Shooting at the proper exposure makes sure that our footage is going to look clean and clear when we go into post-processing. Now, your proper exposure depends on what you're shooting in. If you're shooting in S-Log2, proper exposure is actually going to be overexposed by 1 or 2 stops. And I'll get into that in a later video, but for now, just make sure you're nailing your exposure in every single one of your shots, and to help you do that, grab an ND filter. Now for the 5th and final tip. So my 5th tip for you guys is probably something you don't hear too many people talk about, but it is something that I implement in my videos, only on my 120 frames per second footage, just to make it look a little bit better, and that is sharpen in post. Sharpening in post is a great way to take your 120 frames per second footage and make it just a little bit crisper, but it is a very gentle process. We want to make sure we're not over sharpening our footage, because nothing says amateur video like footage that's way too sharp. So we'll jump into Premiere Pro and I'll show you guys my process for sharpening footage, and hopefully it gives you a better idea of how to sharpen just enough to make your footage look a little bit crisper. Alright, welcome to my computer, and here we are in Premiere. Now, the first thing I want to make note of is we're not going to use this sharpen slider here in the Lumetri color panel. This slider is going to sharpen your entire clip, and we don't want to sharpen the entire thing. We only want to sharpen the details that are going to be most important. So the effect that we're going to use is called Unsharp Mask, which is here. If you search Unsharp, it'll come up. We're just going to double click to apply that to our clip. I want to make note that sharpening is the last thing you should do to your clip. So color your clip, add any noise reduction that you need to do, and add any other effects that you need to do, and then sharpen your clip. That way we're only sharpening the important things, and you know, it wouldn't make any sense to sharpen and then reduce noise. We want to sharpen as the last thing that we do. So again, we're going to use Unsharp Mask, and for those of you guys who just want a quick preset to just slap on your footage and call it good, you can just put in 125 for your amount. I usually go 1.9 for my radius, and then for threshold, we're going to click this little arrow here, drag it down, and then we're just going to bump our slider like 1 or 2 notches. So you can see on her eyes here, if you look, this is before and after. It's just ever so slightly sharper. Now for this particular clip, to be honest, this clip is phenomenal. So the focus is perfect, the exposure is perfect, everything looks really good, the lighting is super good. So in this case, I probably wouldn't even sharpen this clip, but these settings here are a good preset if you're looking to just throw something on all of your clips and call it good. So this is what I use if I'm in a hurry. I'll just slap it on there, call it good, and I won't really care, you know, about getting into the finer details. For those of you guys who really want to sharpen clip by clip and really dial the details, I'll show you how to do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is reset this effect, and we're going to bump our amount all the way up to 500. That just helps us see what we're actually doing, and then we'll bump our radius up quite a bit too. And you'll notice we get a little bit of a halo effect here. Obviously that's not what we want, but that helps us dial in our sharpness. So what we're going to do is go back to our radius and dial it down, usually between about 1 and 2. And this is something you're just going to have to use good judgment. There's no like correct way to do this. You just have to do what actually looks good. The way I do it is I'll start when it's up high, and I'm going to dial it down until that halo goes away and until I have nice sharp lines. So I want to make sure I don't have any haloing at all, and usually we'll find that between 1 and 2 in our radius. Usually I don't ever use 2, but like I said, 1.9 is a pretty good spot. Since this clip is actually extremely sharp already, I'm gonna go somewhere maybe like 1.3. And then for the amount, I almost am always between 100 and 150. Again, because this clip is already super sharp, I'm gonna just guess that 100 is probably good. And then the threshold basically changes what we're actually sharpening. So 0 is sharpening the entire clip, everything. And the more you bump your threshold up, the less stuff is getting sharpened. So 1 is gonna be pretty much nothing is sharp, and 0 is everything is sharp. So for threshold, a lot of times we're only going to use the slider somewhere in the beginning here because we want to still be sharpening our details. We just don't want to sharpen stuff like this blurry background. Obviously that's supposed to be blurry. So for threshold, I'll usually just keep an eye on my clip and bump it up just a tiny bit, and I'll use my before and after to see if I'm still getting the sharpness in my details. So here, before and after, we are getting a little bit. I'll zoom into 100% so you guys can see a little better. But our before and after, not getting too much though, so I'm gonna come down and maybe just one click here on threshold, something like that. I might actually bump this radius just a little bit more just so I can see the sharpening a little better here. So let's go like 1.6. There we go. Now we can see it a little better. So again, that's where we're gonna kind of tweak just to make sure, you know, we're getting it dialed clip by clip. So 1.6 looks good, and I'm gonna say 100 looks good on here too. So if you keep an eye on her eyes, I'll show you guys. Here's my before and my after. So you can see it's sharpening just a tiny bit, but that's all we want. We don't want to overdo our sharpening, like I said before, because footage that's way too sharp, honestly, it looks like crap. So be careful with your sharpening, take your time, and make sure you're not overdoing it. So here's that clip full screen, and that looks great. This is 120 frames per second footage, detail set to 0, using autofocus with good lighting, and this is the type of quality you can expect. So yeah, that's pretty much my entire sharpening process. I'll go through clip by clip using the unsharp mask and dial it just how I showed you guys, just to make sure I'm sharpening only the details and nothing else. If you're in a hurry, you can apply that preset like I was saying before. It's 125, 1.9, and then a single click on your threshold slider. And that's what I'll use if I'm making like a super quick YouTube video. That's what I did for my previous video. Is I just slapped some sharpening on there. Now again, I only sharpen 120 frames per second footage, and only if it needs to be sharpened. Like I said before, this first clip is pretty sharp by itself already, so I probably wouldn't sharpen this, but I did just want to show you guys what my process looks like. So hopefully that helps you out, and hopefully you learned a little bit about how to make your footage look a little better. Alright guys, that's it for me today, but thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you learned a little bit about how to get better quality slow motion footage. Make sure to like this video if you like it, and well, don't if you don't, but if you want to see more, subscribe below. And if you guys are into photography, check me out on Instagram at CodyBlue_. I do dabble in photography a little bit, and if that's something you guys would be interested in, make sure to let me know down in the comments below. Maybe we'll do some photography tutorials. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope it takes your slow motion footage to the next level. So thank you for tuning in, and until next time, we'll see you guys in the next one.